Hello, I'm Deirdre Marie Capone. I am the author of a new book, Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside of His Family. There have been more than 100 books that have been written about Al Capone. Many good authors, but not factual. And none of them knew Al Capone. They didn't see the color of his eyes. They were blue, by the way. Never heard the sound of his voice. Saw some video clips of him. But you know how they did their research? Is they went and they researched old newspaper articles and police blotters. And we know how factual and accurate newspaper articles are, don't you? I mean, I one time witnessed an automobile accident. And when I read the report about it the next day in the paper, it was all wrong. I mean, it wasn't on that street. It wasn't that color car. So when people go and they do research on an infamous man like Al Capone, and they go back and they read old newspaper articles and other people's books, then they want to put their own twist on it, so they make things a little different, or they say something, just a little different. And it's not true. What I'm going to show you today is the reason that Al Capone, that people think he was today, is different from the Al Capone in the 20s and 30s and 40s. It's just what happens in Hollywood. What happens with authors. There's thousands of pictures that have been drawn of Jesus Christ, and no two are the same, because every artist wants to put their own touch on things. Every writer likes to put their personal flavor into things. Script writers, TV shows. It's just progression. There's also times are different. The people of the 20s and 30s and 40s are much different than the people today. I was raised in the Capone family that your word is your bond and family is everything. Today, it seems like everybody lies about anything. I don't. I'm one of the few people that probably are on this earth today that I just don't lie, because I wasn't raised that way. I remember one time telling a fib, and my grandfather, the look that he gave me was unbelievable. Anyway, I'm going to show you why the Al Capone today is not the Al Capone of yesterday. This is the Al Capone that I knew. That's him at his Miami home, and that's me. I am wearing his straw hat on my head, and I have his cigar in my mouth. This is the book that I have written. It's called Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside of His Family. As I said earlier, this is the only book written about Alphonse Gabriel Capone by somebody that actually knew him. I knew him. He's looking down on me in that picture right now. I think probably the big thing about Al Capone and his image has been movies and television shows that have been written about him. The first one was in 1931. That was the year that Al Capone was convicted of income tax evasion. And people were trying to get on the bandwagon to get erroneous information out there, for people to see, because of the notoriety of the trial that Al Capone went through. It was, featured all over the world. There was reporters there all the time. So a movie came out in 1931 with Edward G. Robinson, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And what it says, it tells the story of a hoodlum who ascends the ranks of organized crime until he reaches its upper echelon. A hoodlum, organized crime. Second one that came out also in 1931 was called The Public Enemy. A young hoodlum again rises through the ranks of the Chicago underworld even as a gangster's accidental death threatens to spark a bloody mob war. All right, bloody mob wars. Now it's already starting. That is a hoodlum, and it comes up through Chicago underworld and then sparks bloody mob wars. So already now the facts are being changed. 1932, Paul Muni, Scarface. The subtitle of this movie is The Shame of the Nation. The Shame of the Nation. An ambitious and nearly insanely violent gangster climbs the ladder of success in the mob, but his weaknesses prove to be his downfall. Paul Muni plays Antonio Tony Camonte, an extremely violent hood who claws his way to the top of the underworld. The principal character may be Antonio Camonte, but there's little doubt as to who producers had in mind when they filmed this baby during the Great Depression. Mr. Camonte shares the same initials with one Alphonse Capone, who was about to depart to the big house to serve an 11-year sentence for income tax evasion upon the movie's release on April 9th, 1932. So we went from a hoodlum in the first two movies in 1931 to a nearly insanely violent gangster. And we already have the bloody mob wars. 1959. This is after Al Capone's death. The statute of limitations has run out. No one in the family trademarked or did anything with the name, Al Capone. And now they start to use it, and they have free rein as to what they can say and claim that he did. This movie is called Al Capone, and it starred Rod Steiger. Rod Steiger has the title role of Alphonse Gabriel Capone, charting his rise from New York City transplant to unchallenged czar of the Chicago underworld. This film came out as a result of the TV show that Desilu Productions did in 1957. 1957, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz founded their studio, Desilu Productions, and the very first thing they did was a 2-night TV show called The Untouchables. And they changed the title role of The Untouchables because my family, especially Al's son, Sonny, begged them not to reveal some intimate information that Sonny Capone shared with Desi Arnaz when they were growing up together in Miami. They were both, only children. They were both boys. They loved music. Desi played the bongos, and my cousin Sonny loved to sing. And both of their fathers were criminals. Sonny's, of course, was in Alcatraz. No, he had already died, but when they were raised together, he was in Alcatraz. And Desilu's father was also a criminal because he escaped from Cuba when the Batista organization took over. If he stayed in Cuba, he would have been in jail, but he escaped from Cuba and came to Miami. But this movie was probably the one movie that brought Al Capone's name to the public again. Special Agent Elliot Ness and his elite team of incorrigible agents battle organized crime in 1930s Chicago.
Feds have gotten up this special squad.
You tell. Well, it's a special squad, like Jake says. From all over the country, just to knock over our stuff.
How big's that squad?
Well,
How big?
7 or 8 guys.
And that's what's gonna happen to Ness.
7 men against Al Capone and his Scarface mob. 7 men who dared to challenge an evil empire riddled with vice.
Federal range, there we are.
Starring Robert Stack as the federal agent who couldn't be bribed.
Come on, tell me how much you want.
Not a cent.
Then in 1962, it progresses to this level of violence. I loved the voice of Paul Muni, D's, Dems, Does. My family didn't ever talk like that. It's told bullet by bullet, shock by shock. Desilu Productions just took things over the edge. And it was no wonder that I was fired from my first job in 1958 because of these kinds of films. They were bringing an Al Capone image to the public that was never real, but it sold tickets. People came to watch this kind of junk, and the people that made the money knew it. So it just kept becoming more and more violent, and of course the statute of limitations was gone on the Capone image and the Capone name, and they could say literally anything they wanted. That's why I went into hiding. I didn't want anybody to know that I was Deirdre Capone. I would use an alias. It was because of shows like this. Then in 1967, it's the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This event, and the headline that was printed in all the papers the day after this event, is the one thing that destroyed the Capone name and brought Al Capone down. Chicago, February 14th, 1929. Al Capone finally establishes himself as the city's boss of organized crime. In a North Side garage, his hoods, dressed as policemen, surprise and mow down with machine guns the key members of Bugs Moran's rival gang. The film traces the history of the incident and the lives affected, and in some cases, ended by it. No Capone, no member of Capone's outfit had anything to do with the Valentine's Day Massacre. Couple of facts. Number one, Al Capone's youngest brother, Matthew Capone, was with Machine Gun Jack McGurn in a car in the alley outside of the garage. They were instructed to try to chart Bugs Moran's, path each day. What time does he go to the warehouse? What time does he come back? Because they were going to show him and prove to him that he didn't have to take over any more of Al Capone's establishments. According to my uncle, Bugs Moran's head was getting way too big for his hat, and there was more than enough business for everybody. So my uncle was out there with Jack McGurn, and they saw a touring car, a big black touring car that policemen use, with police inside going down that alley. And then it would come up again. And then it would go down the alley again. And my Uncle Matty said, you know, we got scared because we're sitting there and they saw us sitting there. And we thought that they were going to drag us in, you know, to the station and jail us for loitering. So they left. But my Uncle Matty said they were policemen. He recognized some of them from the precinct that they were in. The next day, the massacre happened. It was real policemen. A story came out right after this happened, and it said, police did it, and we're going to track down and find out who did it. I have another strange quirk of fate. My husband's uncle married the sister of the so-called mechanic that was killed in the Valentine's Day massacre, Johnny May. Johnny May would come home and tell his brother Tommy May, there's going to be trouble because police have been stealing cases of alcohol off the back of our trucks. And Bugs is pissed and he's going to get them fired. That story was covered up. The people who lived in the city of Chicago on February 14th, 1929 knew who did it. And they knew it was not Al Capone. But this incident and the headlines afterward were the one thing that turned the Capone name around. He was not violent. He had nothing to do with this incident. In 1972, there was the first of a trilogy of films called The Godfather, starred Marlon Brando. I liked this film. Marlon Brando's son in the film was called Sonny. They operated like a family. It says the aging patriarch of an organized crime dynasty transfers control of his clandestine empire to his reluctant son. But this again, I mean, people knew. They're talking about Al Capone and in some stretch of the imagination. And it just kept things alive and fresh. The Godfather Part 2 came out in 1974, and it's the early life and career of Vito Corleone in 1920s New York. Is portrayed while his son Michael expands and tightens his grip on his crime syndicate stretching from Lake Tahoe, Nevada to pre-revolution 1958 Cuba. So it was New York, and yes, maybe he was talking about Joe Kennedy rather than Al Capone, because Joe Kennedy ran New York. And all of those boys would go to Cuba on a regular basis. They'd gamble together. Meyer Lansky opened up a huge hotel in pre-revolution Cuba. And, you know, so this was accurate. The third part of the Godfather trilogy, I didn't care for it. It was violent, and it made people think that that whole business was violent, which it was not. 1975, the movie Capone. The story of the rise and fall of the infamous Chicago gangster Al Capone and the control he exhibited over the city during the Prohibition years. Unusually briefly covering the years after Capone was imprisoned. And that's true, of course. They have free reign. You know, there's the movie industry, television industry. I mean, what they can do with Photoshop today, and I mean, they can make anybody look like anything, and it just doesn't seem to be any, as I said earlier, truths that, you know, people have on their lips. Al Pacino's Scarface. Now, it's about a Cuban immigrant, but who is famous for being called Scarface? This was violent film. Violent. And even though it says in 1980, Miami, a determined Cuban immigrant takes over a drug cartel while succumbing to greed. There's plenty of gunplay along with the F word uttered 226 times to satisfy the most hardcore of gangster film fans. The blazing screenplay was rendered by Oliver Stone, who was battling a cocaine habit at the time. So he's directing, he's producing, and he has a cocaine. A little bit twisted, but it's Scarface. This movie that came out in 1987 was a remake of the movie that Desilu Productions did, but it again was absolutely violent, and it put a whole different color to the Prohibition era, to the Al Capone era. People during the 20s, 30s, they didn't act like this. My grandfather told me that he saw the degradation going on in that business. And it was mainly the infiltration of selling drugs. My grandfather told me that they wanted nothing to do with drugs. Drugs control people. Alcohol, you can dry out, you can stop drinking. But with drugs, you cannot. There was never any drugs in anything that the Capone family was involved with, ever. But he saw that the drugs were being introduced. You know, was there bloodshed back in the 20s, 30s? Yes, there was. But my grandfather told me with tears streaming down his cheeks, Deirdre, no innocent person was ever harmed, no child's life was ever in danger, and no woman did anything she did not choose to do on her own. But with movies like this coming out, people were just being brainwashed to think something else. And today, Boardwalk Empire. It chronicles the life and times of Nucky Thompson, who really in real life was Nucky Johnson, the undisputed ruler of Atlantic City, who was equal parts politician and gangster. When Boardwalk Empire, in its first season, Al Capone was depicted as a very violent man. In its third season, Al Capone image has softened. There was one episode where he cried holding his son because his son was deaf and the kids were teasing him at school. And then Al Capone in Boardwalk Empire took out a mandolin and started singing My Buddy to the boy playing his son, Sonny. Of the 110 books out there that have been written about Al Capone, there is only one that said he liked to sing and play the mandolin. And that was my book, Uncle Al Capone. Thank you very much for being here, letting me tell my story. I'll stay around and, work with you guys and answer questions and whatever you need to have me do. Thank you very much.